The world mourns the loss of a rock legend. Ozzy Osbourne, the voice of rebellion and chaos, spent his final days not on stage, but surrounded by love, peace, and family. In this emotional exposé, we take you behind the scenes of the Prince of Darkness's final moments. From tearful conversations with Sharon Osbourne to touching goodbyes from his children, discover the raw, beautiful final chapter of Ozzy's life. Under the glow of a fading spotlight and the quiet hum of a world that once roared his name, a legend prepared to take his final bow. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, the godfather of heavy metal, and the man who turned chaos into an art form, had reached the twilight of a life lived at full volume. But unlike the pyrotechnic-fueled arenas and wild nights that defined much of his past, Ozzy's final days were surprisingly quiet and heartbreakingly beautiful. It wasn't a tour bus or a sold-out stadium that became the backdrop of his farewell, but rather the comfort of his own home, tucked away from the flashing cameras and screaming fans. And yet, the world still felt his presence. The world still waited for every update, every whisper, every breath. Because this was more than a goodbye to a musician. This was the closing act for an entire era. Ozzy Osbourne was many things to many people: a cultural icon, a troubled genius, a father, a husband, a survivor. But as the news spread that his health had taken a turn for the worse, those titles took a backseat to something far more intimate. He was a man preparing to say goodbye. And in those final days, every word, every glance, every memory mattered more than ever. In the weeks leading up to the announcement, close friends and family noticed a shift. Ozzy, who for years had fought through illness with the same ferocity he brought to the stage, began to slow down. The fire was still in his eyes, but his body had grown tired. Parkinson's disease, along with a series of surgeries and infections, had taken a toll not even Ozzy could headbang his way through. Still, he never lost that glimmer of defiance. He joked. He laughed. He reminisced about the wild days of Black Sabbath, about biting the head off a bat, which he always insisted wasn't intentional, and about the countless cities he barely remembered but would never forget. But even the strongest flame begins to flicker, and behind closed doors, the Osbourne family began to brace for what they feared might come. Sharon Osbourne, his wife of more than 4 decades, became his fiercest protector in those final days. She rarely left his side. Nurses and aides came and went, but Sharon was always there, adjusting pillows, soothing his tremors, holding his hand in the quiet moments between sleep and consciousness. To the world, Sharon was a sharp-tongued TV personality, but to Ozzy, she was the steady voice that had guided him through decades of madness. And now, as his body began to falter, she was the voice reminding him he was loved, that he was home, that it was okay to rest. Their children, Amy, Kelly, and Jack, each took time to say their goodbyes in their own way. Jack Osbourne, who had often spoken about his father's health in interviews, was stoic but shaken. He sat beside Ozzy's bed, showing him old videos of concerts, of birthdays, of the early years when the Osbournes were just a family, not a brand. Kelly, once the fiery teen on the Osbournes reality show, was now a mother herself. She wept openly, her son tucked in her arms, whispering that Ozzy would always be a part of them. Amy, ever the private one, stayed longer in the shadows, quiet, contemplative, but her eyes said what her voice couldn't. She was losing her father, and no words could soften that truth. Friends from across the music world reached out. Some visited in person, slipping in through side doors to avoid attention. Others sent voice messages and videos, too emotional to speak directly. Tony Iommi, Ozzy's Black Sabbath band mate and lifelong friend, was among the first. "We've done it all, mate," he said in a tear-streaked recording. "From Birmingham to the bloody moon. I'll see you again, just not yet." Even those who hadn't seen Ozzy in years, musicians, roadies, producers, felt the pull. The outpouring was overwhelming. Fans lit candles outside his home, sent flowers by the truckload, posted thousands of tribute videos across every social media platform. For a man who once symbolized darkness, the light he inspired in others was blinding. Inside the house, Ozzy drifted in and out of sleep. His voice had grown raspy, and at times it was hard to understand him. But he still cracked jokes. He still called Sharon my bird. And when he was lucid, he made it clear that he didn't want sadness. He didn't want anyone mourning him while he was still breathing. "You lot better not be crying over me," he grumbled once, forcing a weak laugh from the room. "I'm not dead yet, you bloody wankers." But even Ozzy knew. The end was near. One night, in what would be one of his final lucid moments, he asked Sharon to bring him his old microphone. It was dented, scratched, the cord frayed. But it was his. He held it in his hands, trembling, and whispered, "One more song." They played Changes, the haunting duet he once sang with Kelly. As the melody filled the room, Ozzy closed his eyes and mouthed the words, tears streaming silently down his face. The days blurred. Nurses monitored his vitals. Sharon barely slept. At times, it seemed like Ozzy might rally. He'd surprise everyone with a burst of energy, a joke, even a short story about the time he accidentally dyed his hair blue before a tour. But those moments became fewer and farther between. His body, once the vessel of primal energy, now lay still. On a Sunday morning, with the sun barely up and the world still quiet, the family gathered. Sharon sat on one side of the bed, Kelly and Jack on the other. Amy stood near the window, her hand pressed against the glass. A soft breeze stirred the curtains. Ozzy opened his eyes, looked around the room, and smiled. "I love you all," he said. And then he was gone. The announcement was made hours later. Sharon, in a statement shared across Ozzy's official pages, wrote, "My husband, my heart, my wild, beautiful soul, Ozzy Osbourne, passed away peacefully this morning surrounded by his family. He left this world as he lived in it, loud, loved, and never forgotten." The music world stood still. Tributes poured in from Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Foo Fighters, Post Malone, and even pop stars who had never shared a stage with him but were shaped by his legacy. Streets in Birmingham, his hometown, overflowed with fans. Murals were painted within days. Radio stations played back-to-back Ozzy sets for hours. But perhaps the most touching moment came days later, at a private family service. Not a public funeral, not a televised spectacle, just family and a few friends gathered in a quiet garden. Sharon spoke, her voice steady but filled with heartbreak. "He wasn't just the Prince of Darkness," she said. "He was our light." Jack spoke next, recounting memories of late-night talks, wild road trips, and the time Ozzy tried to teach him how to scream into a microphone without losing his voice. "He taught me how to live," Jack said. "How to feel everything, even the hard stuff." Kelly, sobbing, shared that her son had called Ozzy Papa Bat. She smiled through her tears. "He didn't just raise us. He raised the bar for what it meant to be a father. A survivor. A legend." In that moment, surrounded by flowers, candles, and the faint hum of his music playing softly in the background, it was clear Ozzy Osbourne's goodbye wasn't just the end of a career, it was the end of a chapter in music history. A closing curtain on a life that had shaken the world awake with its honesty, its insanity, and its undying spirit. Even in death, Ozzy left on his own terms. No scripted PR move. No orchestrated farewell tour. Just truth. Just love. Just family. And for a man who once seemed like he would live forever, perhaps he still will, in every scream, every lyric, every trembling guitar riff that dares to defy silence. As the news of Ozzy Osbourne's passing continued to reverberate around the world, something unusual happened. In a culture that often moves on quickly, especially in the ever-evolving landscape of music, media, and fame, people slowed down. The headlines didn't fade after a day. The tributes didn't stop after a week. Instead, a quiet reverence settled in, as though the world collectively understood that this wasn't just another obituary. This was the end of a living myth. Television networks aired back-to-back documentaries chronicling his life, from his working-class beginnings in Birmingham to the wild ride of Black Sabbath and his controversial solo career. But even these retrospectives, polished and well-produced as they were, couldn't quite capture the essence of Ozzy. Because how do you explain a man who is both a monster and a miracle? A man who outlived every expectation, including his own? Sharon, still reeling from the grief that had begun long before the physical goodbye, took a step back from public life. For years, she had been Ozzy's defender, his business manager, his anchor. And now she was the widow of a man the world had claimed, but whom she had held closer than anyone. For the first time in decades, her home was quiet. Too quiet. No more Ozzy yelling from the other room about the dog. No more 3 a.m. conversations about death and music and God. Just silence and memories. In a rare interview weeks later, Sharon spoke candidly about the weight of that absence. He was chaos, yes, she said, her voice cracking. But he was my chaos. My home. She paused for a long moment before adding, I used to worry about the world forgetting him. But I realize now that's impossible. You can't forget Ozzy Osbourne. You can't unhear that voice or unfeel what he gave people. Meanwhile, Jack and Kelly turned their focus inward. Jack, always the more analytical of the children, began organizing their father's archives, journals, demo tapes, backstage footage that had never been seen. There were letters Ozzy had written but never sent. Lyrics scribbled on napkins. Voice recordings from hospital beds, where even through the pain, he hummed melodies no one else could have conceived. Jack called it Ozzy's mind, and he vowed to preserve it, not just for fans, but for his own children, so they could understand the lineage they came from. Kelly, on the other hand, found herself revisiting the music. Not just the hits like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley, but the deep cuts. The ballads. The songs that revealed the man beneath the madness. She played them every day. Her son, too young to understand the gravity of the loss, would often ask, "Is Papa Bat singing again?" And she would nod, smiling through her pain, because in a way, yes, he was. Ozzy's voice hadn't left them. It was still there, echoing through their home, through their hearts. The fans, ever loyal, didn't let the mourning fade either. Tattoo parlors around the world reported a spike in Ozzy-related ink. His face, his lyrics, his signature, etched onto skin as a permanent tribute to the legacy he left behind. Candlelight vigils took place in every major city. Metal festivals turned into memorials. Even those who had never met him, who had only experienced him through a screen or a stereo, wept like they had lost a friend. Because Ozzy wasn't just a musician. He was a vessel for a kind of freedom the world rarely sees, a walking, screaming reminder that it's okay to be weird, to be broken, to be loud. And yet, the loss also forced many to confront something else, the reality of mortality in rock music. So many icons had passed in recent years. Lemmy, Bowie, Eddie Van Halen. And now Ozzy. The immortals were proving to be human after all. It left a void that no auto-tuned pop anthem could fill. A generation was left asking, who speaks for us now? But in the absence, something sacred emerged. Ozzy's story, his triumphs, his failures, his spectacular survival, began to take on mythological proportions. Schools of music began to study his work in new ways. Psychologists analyzed his lyrics for hidden insights into the human condition. And theologians, oddly enough, debated the spirituality embedded in his chaotic performances, arguing that Ozzy, for all his bat-biting theatrics, was chasing something divine through the noise. In a private ceremony held months after his passing, the Osbourne family unveiled a sculpture in Birmingham, a towering figure of Ozzy, arms outstretched, face tilted toward the sky, cast in bronze but full of motion. The statue wasn't just a tribute. It was a statement. That the man who once said, "I'm not afraid of dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens," had now become immortal in a way no album ever could. And then came the vault. Unbeknownst to most, even to his children, Ozzy had spent the last 2 years of his life recording a secret album. It wasn't meant for the charts. It wasn't meant for release. It was his message in a bottle. A farewell letter disguised as music. Titled simply Dust to Dust, it was raw, stripped down, and hauntingly poetic. No auto-tune. No pyrotechnics. Just Ozzy, a guitar, and the truth. Sharon found it hidden on a hard drive labeled "For Them." When she first listened, she collapsed into tears. The lyrics were full of apologies, confessions, and moments of pure clarity. In one track, he sang, "I spent my life outrunning ghosts, / but now I let them in, / if love is pain, then let it hurt, / I'd live it all again." The album was released posthumously, and critics called it his most honest work to date. Fans called it a gift. Jack called it simply Dad's soul. Even as the media moved on to the next scandal, the next rising star, the cult of Ozzy only grew stronger. Because he wasn't just a man or a musician. He was a movement. A sound that never quieted, even as his body did. And somewhere, in some quiet corner of the world, someone new discovers him every day. A teenager putting on headphones for the first time. A tired adult revisiting the soundtrack of their youth. A rocker playing his riffs in a garage, hoping to tap into just a fragment of that raw energy. Ozzy Osbourne may have left this world. But his spirit? It's still screaming from the speakers. It's still throwing devil horns in the air. It's still reminding us that no matter how dark it gets, you can survive. You can fight. You can live out loud. And maybe, just maybe, you can find peace in the end. Months after his passing, the world hadn't just remembered Ozzy Osbourne, it had absorbed him into its cultural DNA. His voice became more than music, it became a symbol of defiance, a ritual chant passed from one generation to the next. Schools painted murals. Artists released tribute albums. And in cities around the globe, black-clad fans with tears in their eyes raised glasses and roared into the night, "We love you, Ozzy." But the story wasn't done. Sharon Osbourne, whose grief still hung over her like a second skin, made a decision few expected. She announced the release of the Osbourne Legacy Project, a foundation in Ozzy's name that would fund music programs in underserved communities. Ozzy never had structure, she said in a press release. He had chaos and pain and addiction. But he also had a gift. And not everyone with a gift gets a chance to use it. The foundation wasn't just about keeping his name alive. It was about making sure his legacy created something real. Something loud. Something that screamed back at a world that tried to silence people like him. But even as the world turned Ozzy into a saint of rebellion, those who knew him best continued to see the man behind the madness. Friends spoke in interviews, not about the scandals or the headlines, but about the kindness. The odd, gentle moments buried beneath his thunder. Stories surfaced of Ozzy sending money to a struggling roadie. Or calling a fan battling cancer just to scream, "Don't give up, you bastard," down the phone. They talked about the man who had the weight of demons on his shoulders and still somehow found a way to laugh. One friend described him perfectly. He wasn't built to survive what he survived. But he did. And then he turned it into music. How many people can say they turned pain into an anthem? Meanwhile, fans continued to turn their grief into art. Tattoos. Murals. Tribute songs. Even operas. One performance in particular, a full symphonic rendition of Dreamer, performed at the Royal Albert Hall, left the audience in stunned silence. The orchestral arrangement soared, but it was the silence between the notes that carried the weight of loss. In the crowd that night, sitting in the third row, was Sharon. Dressed in black, hands folded in her lap, her eyes didn't leave the stage. When the final note played, and the hall fell into reverent quiet, she whispered to herself, "He would have loved this." Hated the strings, but loved the drama. Ozzy's absence also forced the industry to look inward. The sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle that once defined fame was now seen with more nuance. Conversations began about mental health, about addiction, about the damage artists absorb to entertain the rest of us. Ozzy, who had once been mocked for his slurred speech and public stumbles, was now being honored for having survived what should have destroyed him. And for daring to share that survival, flaws and all, with the world. In time, documentaries began to explore his legacy not just as a musician, but as a cultural mirror. Ozzy had been outrageous, offensive, brilliant, pathetic, hilarious, and tragic, often in the same breath. And maybe that's why people loved him. Because he never hid. He never polished the rough edges. He showed you the mess. And in doing so, he gave permission for everyone else to stop pretending they weren't broken too. One documentary in particular, titled Bats and Broken Glass. The Ozzy Osbourne story premiered on Netflix with record-breaking views. It opened with a quiet shot of his empty mic stand. Then cut to home footage of Ozzy, shirtless in a hotel room, strumming a guitar and crooning a half-written melody that no one had ever heard before. "People think I'm mad," he said in the video, laughing. "But maybe I'm the only one that's sane." The world cried all over again. In Birmingham, on what would have been his 76th birthday, thousands of fans gathered for a candlelight concert in his honor. Musicians from every genre showed up: metal, rock, country, even hip-hop artists who had sampled his voice in their tracks. The air was thick with memory. And when the final act took the stage, the crowd fell silent. It was a hologram. Ozzy in his prime. Arms outstretched. Eyes wild. The same stage stance that had electrified millions. The crowd didn't cheer. They wept. Not because it was fake, but because, in that moment, it didn't matter. It was Ozzy. Still screaming. Still here. Sharon stood backstage, watching it all unfold. She didn't cry. Not then. She smiled. Because somehow, against all odds, her husband, the man who once got banned from flying because he bit the head off a dove in a record label meeting, had become eternal. Later that night, she returned home alone. The house still had his things. His boots by the door. His cane. His old journals, filled with lyrics and sketches and angry scrawls. She sat in the room they used to share, opened a drawer, and pulled out a letter. It was handwritten, the ink shaky, the words unmistakably Ozzy. "If I've gone, don't waste too much time crying. I've already done enough of that for."